Welcome to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. The objective of this podcast is to engage policy professionals over thought-provoking and sometimes sensitive topics. We aim to bring these professionals together in a way that does not feed into the tribalist narratives plaguing society today. It is my hope, and the hope of all involved in this endeavor, that by allowing these ideas to contend and challenge each other with mutual respect, everyone who listens will learn something not previously considered.
The opinions and views of all guests do not necessarily reflect the views of the Knowledge Problem or of anyone involved in its production.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. My name is Dominick Mellusi, and since this is our first episode, we wanted to dedicate it to explain just what the knowledge problem is. It's not just the name of the show, it's actually a very important concept for many economists and political philosophers today. So to help me explain this very important concept, I have Dr. Rosolino Candela. Rosolino is a senior research fellow and associate director of academic and student programs, as well as a senior fellow of the F.A. Hayek Program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center located at George Mason University. So thank you for coming on, Rosolino. It's a very great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
So in looking at the knowledge problem, first of all, I want to take a look at where it comes from. So in economics, there are different schools of thought. These involve different methodologies and ways of thinking about economics itself. I think I'm correct in assuming that the knowledge problem was mainly developed by the Austrian School of Economics. So before we get into what the knowledge problem actually is, could you explain what the Austrian school is and what distinguishes it from other schools of thought?
Sure. So first of all, let me say that the Austrian School of Economics, it's a tradition. It's a tradition that has been in constant evolution since 1871, and that 1871 marks the date of the Marginal Revolution, of which the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, Karl Menger, was a part of, along with William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras. And from the very beginning, what Menger had stressed with regards to economics and what has distinguished the Austrian school from other schools of thought is not only the role of methodological individualism in economics, that is, the unit of analysis in economics where we trace back all sorts of phenomenon, such as prices, trace back to the actions of individuals, right? So methodological individualism is one component, but that's not what distinguishes it from other schools of thought, because there are other economists today that are also methodological individualists. Another aspect that the Austrian school as a tradition emphasizes is spontaneous order analysis. Right? This is something that F.A. Hayek was very famous for advancing, beginning from Karl Menger. But there are other aspects of the Austrian school that distinguish it from other schools of thought, of which they emphasize. The notion of methodological subjectivism, that is, the facts of the social sciences are what people believe and think. And in order to understand social phenomena and events, we have to understand the meanings and purposes attached to individuals' actions. Right? Another aspect is the role of time, which seems kind of trivial, but again is something that has been lost in the comparative static analysis of modern economics today. Now, the Austrian school itself, that term was born out of a debate that occurred between Menger and another school of thought, which had been called the German Historical School. And it was Menger's particular critique of German historicism that led to Gustav Schmoller invoking the term Austrian as a pejorative term, which was a term used in his review of Menger's 1883 book, Investigations into the Social Sciences. And from that, right, what had occurred was that the Austrian school had advanced out of Vienna. And the two major pupils of Menger were Friedrich von Wieser and Eugen von Bamberg. And from those roots in Vienna, right, came a student of Bauhaus named Ludwig von Mises. And out of that tradition began the Vienna Circle. And amongst that circle were other students of Mises, which include Fritz Machlup, Gottfried Haberler, and the most famous one of the most famous being Friedrich Hayek. Eventually, the Austrian school migrated from Vienna to London with Hayek and Robbins, both of which were attempting to advance the Austrian school and translate and bring the works of Mises to the English-speaking language. Mises moving to Geneva in 1934. The home of the Austrian school today now resides in the United States. During World War II, Mises had to flee from Switzerland in 1940, and he eventually landed in the United States. He eventually began working for the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and eventually had a position as a visiting professor in the business school at New York University. And he was there until he retired in 1969. And he was honored in 1969 as a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association. Right? From Mises came other students, including Israel Kirzner, who was one of Mises's first students in America. And from Kirzner, there has been a whole generation of PhD students that have come out of Kirzner that have now find their home and have began their studies and completed PhDs at George Mason University under Don Lavoie. Don Lavoie being the student of Israel Kirzner. And from Don Lavoie, one of Don's main students, Pete Boettke, along with Dave Perchico, Steve Horowitz, and Virgil Storr, have led this advance in Austrian economics, but particularly the role of Pete Boettke has been to create a space from which students can get their PhDs and have since then are now working in academia, public policy, research centers all across America.
Very cool. So you'd say that the current role of the Austrian school, going from Menger to Mises to Hayek to Don Lavoie, now Pete Boettke, and I would include you in that. You've had contact with Israel Kirzner too, right?
Oh, yes.
And now we have the central hub of the Austrian school being in the United States. So I guess it's all the more important to understand its legacy, and one of the major contributions of it is the knowledge problem. And that contribution comes from people you mentioned, Mises and Hayek. Mm-hmm. So when I was an undergrad, I knew of this guy, Hayek, for two main reasons. One was that he wrote the famous book cited by a lot of libertarians and conservatives called The Road to Serfdom, that talked about the dangers of socialism and central planning. The other reason why I knew him was because of some rap videos on YouTube where he debates economist John Maynard Keynes on what the government should do during a recession. But both Mises and Hayek have a rich body of work in their respective careers, and one of them has to do with this problem, sometimes called the calculation problem, sometimes called the knowledge problem. So what is the knowledge problem, and what was Mises's contribution, and what was Hayek's contribution?
Right. So going back to my description of the Austrian school as a tradition, I say it's a tradition for several reasons, because prior to World War II, the Austrian school had just been a component of neoclassical economics, early neoclassical economics. As a matter of fact, if you go to Mises's work, Epistemological Problems in Economics, which had been originally published in 1933, if I'm not mistaken, what's interesting about what Mises says there is that he makes the claim, it's a very profound claim, that the different schools of economic thought of that time, being the Walrasian school, Marshallian economics, and Austrian economics, right, were substantively saying the same thing. The only thing that differed was in terms of their style of presentation, right? This is something that Professor Israel Kirzner also mentions quite often. But as he would talk about himself, by the time he became a student at NYU in 1954, you would say that the statement that Mises made in 1932 was certainly not the case, right? You could find a identifiable and distinguished Austrian school that was certainly different from the neoclassical mainstream. Now, why did that happen, you might say? One of the main debates of the 20th century was something that you had mentioned with regards to the knowledge problem. And this was the socialist calculation debate. And the socialist calculation debate was important for several reasons. The most important for the purposes of the Austrian school was to crystallize its substantive uniqueness that made it distinct from the other schools of thought, okay? From the Marshallian school of economics, or Marshallian economics, or Walrasian economics, right? Marshallian economics emphasizing partial equilibrium, and Walrasian economics emphasizing general equilibrium. Right? And what they had come to discover during that debate was the notion that the market is not the study of equilibrium affairs. It's a study of a process of entrepreneurial discovery. That was the essence of what Austrian economics is about, which had become crystallized as a result of the socialist calculation debate. Now, let's talk a little bit about that now, that I gave some of that background. The socialist calculation debate had begun out of an article written by Ludwig von Mises in 1920 called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. And what he had stated in that article was a response to Marxists at the time, particularly Otto Neurath, who were advocating the complete planning of an entire economy out of a unified, rational plan. That is, ex ante, we could plan the entire economy, right, and produce goods and services not for exchange, but for direct use. And at the time, what the arguments that Marxists had been making, right, in order to remove the wastes of capitalism and the alienation that had become associated with capitalism, was to completely undercut the fundamental basis of capitalism itself, which was ownership, private ownership of the means of production. Private ownership of the means of production. So the notion is that we could eliminate the wastes involved with using money prices and producing goods for direct exchange, and by doing so, we could eliminate that waste and outproduce, using central planning under socialism, a capitalist economy. Right?
So when Marx talks about the waste, when you're reading Marx and he says things like the anarchy of production, is that what he's referring to, the waste of capitalism?
The anarchy of production is what he's talking about there is the spontaneous ordering that occurs through the buying and selling of goods and services. But rather than having goods being built for production, right, then purchasing inputs by producers through money prices and exchanging them for money, and then using those inputs to produce outputs, and those outputs being sold to sellers with money prices, what Marx had argued was, let us just eliminate those exchanges in between inputs, the production process, and then outputs, and then subsume all production for direct use and abolish production for direct exchange. So for the purposes of our discussion, the main point was that the advocates of central planning had argued for the complete abolition of private property in the means of production. That is the classical definition of socialism. Okay. And that was the argument that Mises was confronting in his article. What Mises had argued, though, was the following. And he argued this in terms of a deductive argument, which is if we don't have private property in the means of production, then we won't have market exchange in the means of production. And if we don't have exchange in the means of production, we won't have money prices. Because what are prices fundamentally? They are the terms in which two goods are exchanged, right? Yeah. But if we don't have money prices, what will happen? Then we won't be able to calculate the relative scarcity or the opportunity costs of the means of production inputs in their alternative uses. Let me give an example to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make, that Mises was trying to make with regards to the knowledge problem. And I'm going to connect this with the knowledge problem that Hayek was making. Imagine you're constructing a railroad, okay? Now, if I ask you, if I'm building a railroad, what are railroads usually built with?
Could have steel or nails and a variety of the other materials.
Sure. So we could imagine railroads being built, for sake of argument, between iron or platinum, right?
Oh, yeah.
Now, the question is, from a technological standpoint, if you're an engineer, which metal would make more sense to use? Platinum or iron? Well, platinum, it's a stronger, more durable, long-lasting metal. But in terms of its economic efficiency, right, in terms of its value in alternative uses, we know that using steel or iron is the cheaper metal rather than using platinum. The question is, well, how do we know that? Well, someone might say, and this is the argument I oftentimes use in my classes, well, how do we know that? And students will say, oh, look, iron is cheaper. Of course we're going to build it with iron. But then, and this is where the knowledge problem comes in. But how do you know that? Like, where does that information come from that iron itself is cheaper? And then people are caught off guard. Then they have to stop and think about that. Well, because the price reflects that. Yes, but then I ask them, what is the price? Well, a price is an exchange ratio. It's the terms in which two goods are exchanged. But where do those prices come from? They come from buying and selling, right? So what Mises was fundamentally getting at about rational economic calculation under socialism being impossible was that outside the context of exchange, the information that's embodied in money prices, which reveals the relative scarcity of goods and services, outside the context of private property, that information simply does not exist. It does not exist outside of a context in which individuals can exchange goods and services, in which they bear the full costs and benefits in that exchange process. Now, oftentimes, Mises' argument is misunderstood as he saying that socialism is impossible. That would be an oversimplification of what Mises said. That is, what Mises had argued was if we wanted to advance socialism for other ends, right, for justice, for equality, what have you, then we could abolish private property in the means of production if we wanted to achieve some other non-economic end. But in terms of the ends as they were stated by the Marxists of the time, that abolition of private property would lead to advanced material production over capitalism, what Mises was trying to illustrate is that the means by which to achieve that end, the abolition of private property, would be incoherent to each other. In other words, his argument that economic calculation under socialism would be impossible was a demonstration to illustrate how socialism and central planning would fail on its own terms, according to the desires as outlined by the socialists.
Right, so the socialists are saying that they want to create a system that would be either as efficient as capitalism or superior to capitalism. So the burden of proof is on them to demonstrate how they could do that with the elimination of prices.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, I've already alluded a little bit to this knowledge problem that we're getting at, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. But the critical point to come away with here is that the knowledge problem, as it later became emphasized and developed by Hayek, who had been a direct student of Friedrich Wieser, but he was formerly a student of Wieser, but was a student of Mises in terms of the body of work that he developed coming out of Mises's work, developing his framework in, for example, his study of the business cycle, economic calculation, and spontaneous order, so on and so forth. That being said, what makes the knowledge problem, as it was argued by Hayek, distinct from Mises? It had been embedded in Mises's argument, as I just talked about. But what had happened was, in response to Mises's argument, there was critical responses by a group of economists known as the market socialists, most specifically Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner.
Now, am I correct in saying that both Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner were studying at Chicago in the tradition of neoclassical economics?
Well, Lange had been a professor. He had been a professor at the University of Chicago. He for a time was a visiting professor also at Stanford, but then had returned to Poland. Lerner himself had been an economist. He began his studies, as a matter of fact, under F.A. Hayek at the London School of Economics and taught throughout the United States.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Now, going back to this point that I wanted to make, what was interesting about the market socialist, Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner, they were not Marxists in the sense of rejecting the theory of marginal utility, right? In fact, they rejected the labor theory of value, upon which the theory of the Marxists had been built upon, right? And what was important about this, about the responses that Lange and Lerner had made against Mises to critique him, is what crystallized the distinct school known as the Austrian school that we have today. Although there had been an identifiable Austrian school at the time, it was not yet distinct from other schools of neoclassical economics. Now, what was interesting about Lange and Lerner is the fact that they embraced the theories of neoclassical economics based upon marginal analysis and the study of general competitive equilibrium, which was coming to the foreground of analysis in economics at the time. And one of the greatest ironies in the history of economic thought in the 20th century was that Lange, who was critiquing Mises, had accused Mises of rejecting neoclassical economics and had been making the arguments that the early Austrians had been leveling against the German historicists who denied the laws of economics. And the reason being is the following. The reason being that what Lange and Lerner were arguing is that using the tools of marginal analysis, what we can do is implement a plan of central planning and use the tools of marginal analysis to achieve not only the same outcomes, the same efficient outcomes of capitalism, but also exceed and outproduce capitalism. Now, how was that? What Lange had argued is, all we need to do is implement a central planning board, which will instruct the managers of state-owned firms in a centrally planned economy to follow the rules that firms traditionally follow in a market economy. That is to price according to marginal cost and produce at a level that minimizes average costs, right? This is something that's taught today in standard microeconomics, which are the rules of profit maximization for any particular firm. And what Lange and Lerner had claimed was that since the mathematical equations and the outcomes of general competitive equilibrium by the logic of that construction had to be the same under socialism, by its very nature, had to exist under capitalism, right? So that's why they were critiquing Mises as an historian, as a German historicist. They were claiming that Mises was denying the laws of economics as they applied in capitalism, and say that those can't apply to socialism. But this was a fundamental misunderstanding of Mises. What Mises had never argued that markets will approximate the conditions of general competitive equilibrium. There is a tendency towards which markets tend towards price equaling marginal cost and producing at a level that minimizes average cost. But this is a tendency, a byproduct of a competitive process itself. And this is the response that Hayek leveled against Lange and Lerner, building upon Mises, is that the very conditions of general competitive equilibrium, which they attributed to a capitalist economy, what Hayek had argued is that those very conditions don't exist ex ante as information that can be gathered, right? Because what Lange and Lerner had argued is that, well, yes, of course, central planners are going to make mistakes, right? If there are surpluses in the economy, we just have to, right, bid the price down. And if there are shortages in the economy and there's excess demand of goods and services, the central planning board just needs to bid the prices up. As if somehow equilibrium were a stationary target in the economy. But equilibrium is in fact a moving target, which itself is discovered through the competitive process in the marketplace through buying and selling of goods and services.
So it's a moving target that just can never be reached by the central planning. So they can try to bid it up or bid it down, but it'll never be something that they can just get at one day. There's, I think Hayek explained it when he said that there are millions and millions of equations. Was that Hayek or is that someone else? But
this was originally Pareto.
Okay. There are millions and millions of equations that would have to be solved, and so it's just an impossible goal to be reached, and just it's better off being left to market forces and individuals on the ground making their own decisions with the knowledge that they have at the time.
Yes, that is correct, but I would say that's incomplete for the following reason. It's not as if we don't have the information to fill the numbers in those equations, right? That was the argument that was leveled as a critique against Hayek, because he was misunderstood, precisely because Lange and Lerner were filtering that argument through the paradigm of neoclassical economics, in which the benchmark of analysis is perfect competition, where there is perfect information. So much so that Lange, one of the very last papers that he wrote, it was in 1967, it's a book chapter in dedication to an economist named Maurice Staub. What he had argued was, now that computers had become so technologically advanced, we can now use computers to gather the information necessary in order to plan an economy and fill those simultaneous equations that would be required to plan an entire economy. But again, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what Mises and Hayek were trying to argue, that the knowledge that's embedded in a market economy that's required to allocate resources to their most valued uses it's not simply that it was tacit and dispersed. That is true, as Hayek argued. But the key aspect is that the nature of knowledge that's tacit and dispersed is also contextual. It emerges only in a context of private property, where, for example, if firm owners sustain a profit, they learn from that profit by producing more of that good. But when they sustain losses and they bear the full context, they bear the full consequences of those losses, they learn to minimize them. What Hayek and Mises were fundamentally trying to emphasize is that the market is a learning mechanism. It's a mechanism of discovery by which, through that competitive process, we discover how to allocate resources to their most valued uses. So the outcome can't be known ex ante. It has to be discovered through the competitive process itself. So the notion of knowledge that they're talking about is not the same thing as scientific knowledge that's already out there in people and available scientifically, right? And it's available, objectively. The nature of knowledge is subjective. It's embedded in people's minds. So that the role of the price mechanism, what Hayek emphasized that the price mechanism is a telecommunication mechanism. It's a communication mechanism that translates subjectively held information in people's minds into, subjectively held knowledge into publicly available information. And that outside the context of exchange, individuals buying and selling goods, those prices don't emerge. And therefore, without those prices as guides to production and consumption, resources won't be allocated to their most valued uses.
And so things would be, you might say that that's where massive amounts of waste would come from, and those are the consequences of eliminating private property, the institution of private property, and the rest of the institutional arrangements that allow for products to be allocated to their most optimal use that we can see.
That's exactly right, because the role of private property is fundamentally not the idea that we own or we have rights to goods and services. Well, the notion of private property's rights is such that we don't just exchange goods and services. That is, they assign also responsibility over the use of those goods and services. And what private property does is assign full accountability, full responsibility of the costs and benefits of one's decision making. Right? So that if firm owners decide to build a product, and that product doesn't sell, now what happens? They have to purchase inputs in the marketplace to produce those goods. But if those goods don't sell above their opportunity cost, the opportunity cost of the inputs in alternative uses, so going back to my steel example, right? I purchase steel to produce railroads. Now, if I produce those railroads and those railroads don't yield a profit above those costs of production, which is the purchase of those inputs, what is the price mechanism communicating to me?
That you're suffering a loss and that you need to change whatever you're doing in order to make a profit and allocate those resources effectively.
Right, but it's precisely because there are individuals bidding for that steel in alternative uses that price, that high price relative to, as a cost of production, relative to the profits that I could obtain, the fact that there are high costs of production, meaning I had to pay a high price for steel, and the expenses of purchasing that steel were over the profits that I could have obtained, implies that that steel has more valuable uses elsewhere. That price is communicating to me that somewhere, I may not even know who that person is, but that price is communicating to me that steel has more valuable uses elsewhere. But notice one thing, without that intentional competition for that steel, right? I own money, I exchange money for that steel, and I offer higher prices for that steel. Without that process of exchange, that information, that knowledge, if you will, simply does not exist.
Awesome. So, one more quick question. Now that we've gotten the theory down, it's always important to see if your ideas work out in real life. Can we see real-world examples of this knowledge problem in action? Can we point to something out there, to examples of socialism or central planning, and say, hey, the Austrians might have a point here?
Let's keep in mind that Mises's original arguments against economic calculation, against economic calculation under socialism, was born out of the context of the attempts of centrally planning of an entire economy in the Soviet Union. And that system collapsed, right, precisely because of the inability for planners, however benevolent they would have been, right, to allocate resources to their most valued uses. So the wastes of socialism simply piled up on itself, and the system itself collapsed from within. But keep one thing in mind, and this goes back to Mises's argument, is that the ills of socialism, which he discussed, and this is something that's very important for modern regimes today, they're not based on the failures of the motivations of individuals, right? So I'm sure you're old enough to remember who Mother Teresa was. Sure. We could put Mother Teresa as the central planner of, for example, Venezuela today. And even if she has the best intentions to allocate resources to their most valued uses, what Mises and Hayek would say is, even though she is perfectly motivated to engage in this activity, to use resources productively and efficiently, the fundamental question is, where is that information going to come from? Now, if Mother Teresa is a deity, right, well, we define that problem out of existence. Sure. But if we're assuming a very well-motivated individual, the question is, where is that knowledge going to come from? And outside the context in which individuals bear the full responsibility of their decision-making, like in the marketplace in terms of profit and losses, the information that would be required to allocate resources to their most valued uses simply does not exist, which is, according to Mises, why economic calculation under socialism is impossible.
One more question, too. If I'm someone listening to this and I wanted to learn more about Mises, Hayek, the Austrian school, or the knowledge problem in general, what are some recommended readings that I can check out?
So, as far as recommended readings are concerned, to take up your question, I would most certainly read Karl Menger's Principles of Economics. That's a classic in the Austrian tradition. But I would also read Mises's Human Action, Hayek's Individualism and Economic Order. Hayek and Mises certainly wrote a lot, but if you wanted to get at the core of what they were talking about, I would certainly read Human Action and Hayek's Individualism and Economic Order. And within Hayek's Individualism and Economic Order is one of his most famous academic, if not his most famous academic article, The Use of Knowledge in Society. Although his most popularly known work would be The Road to Serfdom, which also would be a highly recommended book to be reading today.
Awesome. So there we have the knowledge problem. Thank you, Dr. Rosolino Candela. It was a pleasure having you, and I always appreciate our conversations, and you are a pleasure to listen to.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider following our social media accounts to stay up to date on new developments in the show and to share your opinions. We'd like to give one final thank you to our guests today for taking the time to engage in productive conversation. We would like to also thank our sponsors, Young Voices.